The dust tasted of endings. It coated her tongue, settled in the folds of her ragged dress, and filmed her eyes so the world bled into a hazy, heat-shimmered watercolor of browns and grays. She was tied to a hitching post in the center of what passed for a town, a single street of false-fronted buildings that leaned into each other like tired drunks. The rope was coarse, biting into the skin of her wrists, but she had stopped feeling it hours ago. Pain was a country she had lived in for so long she had forgotten the language of its opposite. Her bare feet were cracked and swollen on the hard-packed earth. Flies, drunk on the sun and the smell of sweat, orbited her head in lazy, buzzing constellations. She did not flinch. She had learned the economy of movement, the conservation of dignity in absolute stillness. To fight was to perform, and she would not give them a show. The crowd was a beast with many mouths. It murmured and shifted, its collective gaze a physical weight. There were the hard-faced women with their lips pursed in judgment. Seeing in her a mirror of some dark fear they kept locked away. There were men whose eyes slid over her like greasy hands, calculating worth in bushels of wheat or heads of cattle. Children, emboldened by their parents' cruelty, sometimes darted close, their faces masks of morbid curiosity, before skittering away. She kept her eyes fixed on a point just beyond them all, on a loose board on the front of the general store. It was a small, insignificant detail in a world that had become monstrously large and threatening. It was an anchor. As long as she could see that board, she was not entirely lost in the sea of faces. A man named Barlow, the one who had tied her here, strode from the saloon, wiping beer foam from his thick mustache with the back of his hand. He was a man built of bluster and cheap whiskey, his gut straining the buttons of his vest. He saw her not as a person, but as a failed investment, a stubborn mule that refused to pull. Last chance, he boomed, his voice rolling over the dusty quiet. Hard worker, quiet as a mouse. Good for any sort of labor. $10 and she's yours. Settle my debt at the smithy. The crowd rustled. A few men spat. The price was an insult, a clear sign she was damaged goods. The silence that followed was more damning than any shout. It was the silence of dismissal. She was being erased right here in the middle of the sunbaked street. She felt herself grow thin, transparent, like smoke about to be torn apart by the wind. She braced for the final humiliation, being untied and cast out to be taken by the wilderness or whatever scavenger, human or animal, found her first. Then a shadow fell over her. It was different from the shadows of the buildings. It had substance. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace that cut through the nervous energy of the street. A man stood there, having separated himself from the periphery where he had been leaning against the blacksmith's wall, unnoticed. He was tall, thin as a fence rail, and wore a dusty duster that seemed to carry the scent of sage and solitude. His face was a landscape of its own, carved by sun and wind and some deep, abiding sorrow that lived behind his eyes. He carried whole winters in his eyes. He looked not at Barlow, but at her. His gaze was not greedy, nor was it pitying. It was steady, quiet, and deeply tired. He saw the rope, the bare feet, the vacant stare fixed on the loose board. He saw the architecture of her suffering. Silas, for that was his name, though few in the town used it, had come for a sack of flour and 3 iron nails. He lived a life pared down to necessities. He had buried his wife, Sarah, and their small son 2 winters past, and with them he had buried most of his words. His world had shrunk to the size of his homestead, a small patch of stubborn dirt carved out of an uncaring land. He had watched the scene unfold with a familiar, hollow ache in his chest. It was the casual cruelty of the world, a spectacle he had long ago learned to turn away from. But today he did not. He saw the line of her jaw, the rigid set of her shoulders. It was not defiance. It was the last wall of a house that was about to collapse. In her stillness, he recognized a silence much like his own. Barlow, seeing a potential customer, swaggered forward. Interested, friend? She don't eat much. Silas shifted his gaze to Barlow. The movement was slight, but it was enough to make Barlow's smirk falter. There was a stillness in Silas that was different from the woman's. Hers was the stillness of a trapped animal. His was the stillness of a mountain. He reached into his worn leather pouch, his movements unhurried. The town held its breath. This was not the expected turn of events. Silas was a ghost, a man who moved through their lives without leaving a ripple. He did not pull out coins. Instead, he produced a small, folded piece of paper. It was a receipt, a marker for a debt Barlow owed him for 3 months of mending tack. A debt Silas had never intended to collect. He held it out. His voice, when it came, was low and raspy from disuse, like it came from under floorboards. "We're square," he said. The two words hung in the air, plain and heavy as stones. It was not a purchase. It was a cancellation. An erasure of a different kind. Barlow stared at the paper, then at Silas, his beady eyes narrowing. He was being made a fool of, but in a way he could not fight. The debt was real. He snatched the paper from Silas's hand. "She's your problem now," he snarled, and turned on his heel, stomping back toward the saloon, the deal done. Silas paid him no mind. He walked to the hitching post. She did not look at him, her eyes still locked on that loose board across the street. He pulled a small, worn pocket knife from his coat. The blade made a soft clicking sound as it opened. It was the only sound in the now silent street. He did not touch her. He reached past her, his arm moving with care, and sawed through the thick rope. The fibers parted with a dry, whispering sound. The tension fell away from her wrists. For a moment, she did not move, as if the rope had grown into her, and its absence was a new kind of violation. Then, slowly, she lowered her arms. Red welts, raw and angry, circled her wrists. He folded the knife and put it away. He turned without a word and started walking down the street, away from the town, toward the open, dusty plain. He did not look back to see if she was following. He didn't have to. After a long, suspended moment, she took a single, faltering step. Then another. Her shadow, long and thin in the afternoon light, stretched out and merged with his. The journey to his homestead was a pilgrimage made in silence. The sun beat down, turning the air to a shimmering curtain of heat. Dust lifted behind them like the ghosts of all the words they did not speak. He walked ahead, his pace steady but not hurried, measured to the land itself. She followed a dozen feet behind, a detached shadow tracing his path. Her feet, already brutalized, screamed with every step on the sharp stones and hot earth. She wrapped her torn dress around them as best she could, but it offered little comfort. She focused on the rhythm of his boots striking the ground, a slow, metronomic beat that became her entire world. Thud, thud, thud. A sound to hold on to. Once he stopped. He did not turn around. He simply stood, waiting, his back a rigid line against the vast, empty sky. He unslung a canteen from his shoulder and set it on the ground behind him. Then he walked on. She approached it as a deer might approach a salt lick in a hunter's clearing. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The water was warm, tasting of metal and dust, but it was the most profound kindness she had known in an age. She drank, letting the water trace cool paths down her throat, and it felt like being given back a piece of herself. She screwed the cap back on, her fingers clumsy, and hurried to catch up, clutching the canteen to her chest like a holy relic. They arrived as dusk was bleeding blood orange and purple across the horizon. The homestead was more a scar on the land than a part of it. A small, sod-roofed cabin, a leaning barn, and a few skeletal fences fighting a losing battle against the wind. It was a place of immense, aching loneliness. Near the cabin, under a lone, twisted cottonwood, was a small mound of stones with a weathered wooden cross. Sarah, and a smaller mound beside it. He went to the water pump, his movements creaking with exhaustion. He worked the handle until water, brown and sputtering at first, finally ran clear. He filled a bucket and left it by the cabin door before disappearing inside. She stood in the yard, a stranger on the edge of a stranger's life. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath, watching her. The wind turned mean, whispering through the dry grass, and she shivered, pulling the thin fabric of her dress tighter. For a terrifying moment, she thought he might have locked the door, that this was just another kind of post to be tied to. But the door remained slightly ajar. A sliver of warm, yellow light sliced through the encroaching darkness. She pushed it open. The inside was one room, spare and clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a narrow bed in one corner, and shelves holding a few tin plates and a Bible. It smelled of wood smoke, old sorrow, and soap. He was at the hearth, coaxing a fire to life. He did not look at her. He gestured with his head toward the table. A bowl of water sat there, along with a clean, frayed piece of cloth. Beside it, a heel of bread and a slice of dried meat. An offering. She went to the table and dipped the cloth in the water, the coolness a shock to her skin. She cleaned the grime from her face and hands, then the raw, chafed skin of her wrists. The sting was sharp, but it was a clean pain. A pain that might lead to healing. She ate the bread slowly, making it last. It was dry and hard, but it filled a space inside her that had been empty for a long time. He ate his own meal standing by the fire, his back to her. When she was done, he finally spoke, his voice still low and rough. "The loft," he said, nodding toward a wooden ladder leading to a small space under the eaves. "Blankets are there. I don't lock the door. That was the contract. Food, shelter, and the promise of an unlocked door." It was more than she had dared to hope for. She climbed the ladder, her limbs heavy as stone, and found a clean, patched blanket folded neatly on the rough floorboards. She wrapped herself in it, the coarse wool a small comfort against the chill that had settled deep in her bones. Below, the fire crackled. The man sat in one of the chairs, staring into the flames, a silent sentinel in the heart of his own desolate kingdom. From her perch in the shadows, she watched him, and for the first time in months, she slept without dreaming of ropes. The days settled into a rhythm marked not by a clock but by the sun's slow march across the sky. Their lives became a silent, parallel dance of chores. He would rise before dawn, his movements quiet, and head out to the barn to tend his single, sway-backed horse or mend a piece of harness that looked as weary as he did. She would wake to the sound of his departure and descend from the loft. The first morning, she had stood uncertainly in the middle of the small cabin, a ghost in another's home. Then she saw the broom he had fashioned from prairie grass, and the simple, physical act of sweeping the dirt floor felt like a prayer. She swept away the dust of the previous day, creating a small circle of order in the vast wilderness. When he returned, he said nothing, but he noticed the clean floor, the neatly stacked plates. A small, almost imperceptible nod was his only acknowledgement. She learned the geography of his grief. She learned it in the way he never sat in the second chair at the table, the one she now used. She learned it in the patch of faded wildflowers she found him tending by the 2 graves under the cottonwood. One day, she found a single, stubborn prairie rose blooming by the creek bed. She picked it and, when he was in the fields, placed it in a tin cup of water on the larger of the 2 graves. He never mentioned it, but the next evening he left a small, polished river stone on the step to the loft for her. A silent thank you. They began to stitch their lives together with these raw, unspoken threads. She took over the cooking, turning his meager supplies of flour and dried beans into meals that were less about sustenance and more about communion. She found a rhythm in kneading dough, in stirring a pot over the fire. Her hands, once bound, were now creators of warmth and nourishment. She even found herself humming sometimes, fragments of old tunes she thought she had forgotten. The sound was thin and reedy in the quiet cabin, but it was a sound of life. He, in turn, began to provide for her in small, deliberate ways. He left a pair of Sarah's old work boots by the door, worn but sturdy. They were too big, but she stuffed them with rags and they kept the rocks from her feet. When a cold snap came with the autumn winds, she woke to find a heavy wool shawl draped over the ladder to the loft. It smelled of him, of dust and wood smoke and something else, something like lonely integrity. One afternoon, the wife of a neighboring homesteader, a woman whose face she vaguely remembered from the crowd in town, rode over, ostensibly to borrow some salt. The woman's eyes darted around the cabin, taking in the clean floor, the smell of baking bread, and her presence in it. "Heard Silas took you in," the woman said, her voice sharp with curiosity. She looked at her as if she were a strange plant that had sprouted in a familiar field. Before she could even think of a response, could shrink back into the voiceless person she had been, Silas came to the door. He had been mending a fence post and held the hammer in his hand. He did not look angry, but his presence filled the doorway completely. "Martha," he said, his voice flat. "What do you need?" "Just some salt, Silas." He turned, retrieved a small pouch from a shelf, and handed it to her. His eyes never left the woman's face. The message was clear. State your business and go. Martha took the salt, her gaze flickering one last time to the woman by the hearth. "You're looking better," she offered, the words falling flat. She scurried away like a nervous chicken. Silas watched her go, then closed the door. He leaned against it for a moment, the hammer still in his hand. He looked across the room at her. It was the longest he had ever held her gaze. "Her bread is always dry," he said. A tiny, unfamiliar bubble of something rose in her chest. It was a ghost of a laugh. She looked down at the loaf she had just pulled from the hearth fire. It was a little lopsided, a little dark on one side. "This one might have died in vain," she whispered, the words feeling strange in her own mouth. A corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile. "She never complained about mine." That night, the cold was deeper. The wind howled around the corners of the cabin, a lonely, keening sound. She lay in the loft, wrapped in her blanket and the wool shawl, but the chill was inside her. It was the memory of the rope, the staring eyes, the feeling of being less than human. A cry tore from her throat before she was fully awake. It was a small, strangled sound. She sat bolt upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. The dream had been vivid, the hitching post, Barlow's sneering face, the suffocating feeling of being trapped. "Don't lock me in," she gasped into the darkness, the words a plea to a faceless terror. Below, a floorboard creaked. the soft scrape of a match, and then the gentle bloom of light from the lamp. Silas stood by the hearth, his figure a tall silhouette against the growing flame. He did not climb the ladder or call out to her. He simply added another log to the fire, stoking it until the flames leaped high, casting warm, dancing shadows on the walls and chasing the cold darkness back into the corners. He sat down in his chair, the one he always took, and picked up a piece of leather he was mending. He worked in silence, his presence a steady, unwavering anchor in the stormy night. He did not intrude on her fear, but he refused to let her face it alone. She watched him from the loft, the frantic pounding in her chest slowly subsiding. The warmth from the fire rose, touching her face. The cabin was filled with the steady, rhythmic scrape of his knife on the leather and the crackle of the flames. It was the sound of safety. After a long while, her trembling stopped. She lay back down, but she did not sleep. She listened to the sounds of the man keeping watch below, a silent guardian against the ghosts of the past. And she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her soul that the foundation of a new life was being laid, here in the small, quiet room, by the light of a midnight fire. The quiet rhythm of their life was a fragile thing, a thin sheet of ice over deep water. She knew it, felt it in the way the wind sometimes carried the distant sound of a horse, making her freeze, her hands still on a warm plate or a piece of mending. The past was not a country you could leave behind entirely, its ambassadors were always on the road. The harbinger came on a crisp autumn morning. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue and the air smelled of frost and wood smoke. Silas was splitting logs, the rhythmic thud of his axe a steady heartbeat for the homestead. She was hanging laundry on a line stretched between the cabin and the cottonwood tree, his shirts, her dress, the few linens they owned, all scrubbed clean. It was a domestic scene so peaceful it felt like a dare to the universe. She saw them first. Two riders cresting the low ridge to the east, their figures stark silhouettes against the morning sun. They were not neighbors. Neighbors approached from the west, along the creek. These men moved with a purpose that made the hair on her arms stand up. Her breath caught in her throat. The clothespin she was holding fell from her numb fingers. Silas stopped his work, the axe resting mid-swing. He had not seen the riders, but he had seen the change in her. He had learned to read her stillness. He followed her gaze to the ridge. For a long moment he did not move, his body tensing, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching under his worn shirt. He lowered the axe slowly, deliberately, and leaned it against the woodpile. He wiped his hands on his trousers and walked toward the cabin. "Go inside," he said, his voice quiet but carrying a new, hard edge. It was not a request. She did not argue. She gathered the laundry basket and hurried into the cabin, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She shut the door but left it open a crack, her eye pressed to the narrow slit. The world shrank to the sliver of dusty yard. The riders drew closer, their horses kicking up plumes of dry earth. She recognized the man in the lead instantly. It was Barlow, his bulk overflowing the saddle. The man beside him was lean and ferret-faced, a hired gun with cold, empty eyes. They pulled up 20 feet from the cabin. Barlow's gaze swept over the homestead, the neat woodpile, the clean laundry line, the tended graves, and a sneer twisted his lips. He looked at Silas, who stood before the cabin door, his posture relaxed but rooted to the earth. He was not armed, but he seemed more dangerous than the man with the pistol on his hip. "Silas," Barlow boomed, forcing a jovial tone that did not reach his eyes. "Didn't expect to find you playing house." Silas said nothing. His silence was a wall. "I've come for my property," Barlow said, his voice hardening. He gestured toward the cabin with a flick of his wrist. "The debt's been settled with the smithy. Our deal was for you to take that on, not to take the girl. She's worth more than that, and I've got a buyer down in Chilton who's willing to pay a fair price." "She's not property," Silas said. The words were flat, devoid of emotion, but they landed with the finality of a closing door. Barlow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't play the saint with me. I saw you watching her that day. You wanted her just like any other man. You just found a cheaper way to get her. But the deal's off. I'm reclaiming what's mine by law." "There is no law out here that makes a person a thing," Silas replied, his voice still low, still calm. He took a single step forward. "This is my land. You are not welcome here. Turn your horses and ride away." The ferret-faced man shifted in his saddle, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. Silas's eyes flickered to the man, a brief, dismissive glance before returning to Barlow. "You're a fool, Silas," Barlow spat. "One lonely widower against the world. You think you can protect her? I'll come back with the sheriff. I'll come back with more men. I will have what is mine." Inside the cabin, she felt the old coldness seeping into her bones. He was right. Silas was one man. The world was full of Barlows. She looked around the small room that had become her sanctuary, the hearth, the table, the ladder to the loft. It was a fragile shell and the storm was here to break it. But then she saw it. Lying on the stone hearth was the heavy, cast-iron skillet she had used that morning to cook their breakfast. It was black and solid and real. Her hand went to the doorknob. It was cold, firm. Her heart was still pounding, but a new feeling was rising alongside the fear. A hot, slow-burning anger. She had been an object. A piece of property. A thing to be bartered and sold. But here, in this cabin, she had been a person. She had made bread. She had swept a floor. She had placed a flower on a grave. She had been seen. The door swung open. The sudden movement drew all three men's attention. She stepped out into the sunlight, squinting against the brightness. She did not have the skillet. She did not have a weapon. She had only herself. She walked until she stood beside Silas. She felt the warmth radiating from his body, a solid presence next to her. She looked directly at Barlow, meeting his surprised, angry gaze without flinching. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the whisper he might have remembered. It was clear and steady, forged in the quiet fires of the last few months. "I am not yours," she said. The words were simple. 3 small stones thrown against a giant. But they changed the landscape of the yard. They were a declaration of existence, of self. She was no longer a passive object in their story. She was a character speaking her own lines. Barlow stared at her, momentarily speechless. He had expected tears, pleading fear. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding defiance. He looked from her to Silas, standing together, a united front. They were 2 solitary figures, but together they formed something strong, something he hadn't accounted for. Silas did not look at her, but she felt him shift his weight, a subtle movement that aligned him more fully with her, standing not just in front of her, but with her. His hand, which had been hanging loose at his side, slowly clenched into a fist. The knuckles turned white. "You heard her," Silas said. His voice a low growl now, the floorboards finally giving way to the thunder beneath. "She is not yours. She has a name. And this is her home." The ferret-faced man's hand tightened on his pistol. "Don't be stupid, Barlow. Let's just take her." But Barlow's bravado was a fragile thing built on bullying the weak and unopposed. He saw the look in Silas's eyes now, a look that spoke of winters and loss and having nothing left to fear. He saw the woman beside him, no longer a broken thing but a person with a will of steel. And he saw the silent, lonely land around them, a place where a man could disappear and the wind would tell no tales. Section, he was a predator, but he was also a coward. The fight would be costly, and his greed was not greater than his fear of a man with nothing to lose. He pulled at the reins of his horse, his face flushed with anger and humiliation. "This isn't over," he blustered, the threat sounding hollow even to his own ears. "You'll regret this, Silas. Both of you." He spurred his horse, turning it so sharply it whinnied in protest, and galloped back toward the ridge, the hired gun trailing behind him like a stray dog. She and Silas stood together in the yard, watching them go, not moving until their figures were once again small silhouettes swallowed by the vastness of the land. The dust they had kicked up slowly settled back to the earth. The silence they left behind was different. It was not empty. It was full. It was the open, breathing space after a storm. She became aware that she was trembling, a fine tremor running through her entire body. The anger and adrenaline receded, leaving behind a raw, bone-deep exhaustion. "I was scared," she said, the admission a quiet confession to the empty air. Silas finally turned to look at her. His face was still hard, but the winter in his eyes had retreated. He reached out, his calloused, hesitant fingers brushing her arm. It was the first time he had touched her skin. The contact was electric, a jolt of warmth and connection that steadied her more than any words could. "I know," he said. His gaze fell to her feet, firmly planted on the ground of the home she had just claimed as her own. "You didn't run." He let his hand fall away. He turned and picked up the axe from where it lay by the woodpile. He looked at the half-split log, then at the house, at her. He leaned the axe back in its place. The work could wait. He walked back to the cabin, his shoulders a little less stooped, his step a little lighter. He held the door open for her. As she passed him to step into the warmth and safety of the hearth, their eyes met. In his, she saw a flicker of something new, something that looked almost like hope. The house, it seemed, breathed again. In the quiet aftermath, a new kind of silence settled between them. It was not the silence of strangers, nor the silence of shared grief. It was a comfortable, lived-in silence, the kind that exists between two people who no longer need words to understand the currents of each other's hearts. The threat had been repelled, but more than that, a bond had been forged in the fire of that confrontation. It was solid, real, unshakable. That evening, they sat by the fire, not with him standing and her at the table, but together in the two chairs pulled close to the hearth. The flames cast a warm, flickering light on their faces. She was mending one of his shirts, the needle moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. He was carving a piece of wood, his knife shaving off thin, fragrant curls of pine. He stopped his work, holding the small piece of wood up to the light. He had been shaping it into a bird, a rough, simple thing, but full of life. He set it down on the mantelpiece. "I never asked your name," he said into the quiet. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. She stopped her sewing, the needle poised in midair. She looked at her hands, at the frayed cloth of the shirt. She thought of the person she had been before the rope, before the town, before Barlow. That person felt like a stranger from a distant land. A ghost whose name had been scoured away by shame and hardship. To speak it now would be to invite that ghost into this new, fragile piece. She shook her head slowly. Not a refusal, but an admission. That name was gone. It belonged to the woman tied to the post. He nodded, understanding what was left unsaid. He looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful. The flames danced in his wintry eyes. "My wife," he began, his voice low and soft. "Her name was Sarah. My son was Daniel." He spoke their names as if they were precious, fragile things, letting them exist in the warm air of the cabin for a moment before they faded. They were good names, strong names. He turned his gaze to her. It was gentle, open, stripped of all its old defenses. "A new life should have a new name," he said. "I would call you Lena if you'll have it. It means light, it seems right. Lena." She tried the name out in the quiet of her mind. It felt strange and new, like a pair of shoes that hadn't yet been molded to her feet. But it was a clean name, a name with no history of pain attached to it. It was a gift. It was a beginning. She looked at him, at this quiet, broken man who had offered her shelter, then protection, and now an identity. A small, real smile touched her lips for the first time. "Lena," she said, tasting the word. It was a good name. The next morning, they woke to the destruction. In the night, a wind had come, not the howling gale of a storm, but a mean, spiteful wind that had found the weakest point of the homestead and broken it. A long section of the fence that bordered the west pasture lay in ruins. The old posts snapped, the rails scattered like kindling. It was the fence Silas had been mending. It felt like a final, petty blow from a cruel world. He stood before the wreckage, his hands on his hips, his face grim. It was another thing to be fixed, another battle against the slow decay of things. But he was not alone this time. She, Lena, came and stood beside him, holding a cup of hot coffee. She handed it to him, and he took it, their fingers brushing. "It's a big job," he said, stating the obvious. "Then we should start," she replied simply. And so they did. It was hard, grueling work. He dug new post holes in the unforgiving earth, his muscles straining. She gathered the old rails, dragging them into a pile, her body aching with the unaccustomed labor. They worked together, side by side, under the vast, indifferent sky. They did not talk much, communicating instead through the shared rhythm of the work, the grunt of effort, the passing of a tool. They were not just rebuilding a fence. They were building something else. With every new post he set firmly in the ground, he was planting a root. With every rail she helped him lift into place, she was defining the borders of their new world, a sanctuary built not of wood and wire, but of shared effort and mutual reliance. The fire of the confrontation had burned away the old structures, and now in the ash, something new was waiting. They were stitching their lives together, not with thread, but with sweat and splinters and the shared weight of timber. By the time the sun began its descent, the fence was restored. It was not perfect. It was a patchwork of old wood and new, scarred and weathered, but it was strong. It stood firm against the wind. They stood back, dirty and exhausted, and looked at their work. A sense of profound, quiet satisfaction settled over them. They had faced the ruins and built something better. That night, as the last light faded from the sky, they sat on the small porch of the cabin. It was the first time they had done so. It had always been his space, his solitary vantage point. Now it was theirs. The second chair no longer felt like a memorial, but simply a place for her to sit. The air was cool and clean. The stars began to emerge, sharp and brilliant in the endless dark. The cabin behind them was warm, a single lamp glowing in the window. The house was no longer a hollow shell of grief. It breathed. It had a heartbeat, a rhythm made of two lives instead of one. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly. He looked out at the mended fence, a dark line against the pale grass. He looked at the two graves under the cottonwood, peaceful in the starlight. And then he looked at the woman beside him, her face calm in the dim light, her hands resting quietly in her lap. He was still a man who carried winters in his eyes. But now, there was a glimmer of spring on the horizon. She was still a woman who had known the taste of dust and despair. But now, she knew the taste of bread she had baked herself, and the solid feel of a home she had helped to build. Section, they were two broken people on a broken piece of land. But here, together, under the vast, silent gaze of the stars, they were beginning to feel whole. He reached over, not with the hesitant uncertainty of before, but with a quiet confidence, and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the shared warmth of their hands, everything was said. This story, it ain't just about a rescue on some dusty frontier. It's about the quiet truth that sometimes the most profound acts of salvation don't come with a cavalry charge or a trumpet's call. They arrive in the form of a shared bowl of water, a swept floor, an unlocked door. It's about recognizing that every soul has a name, even if they've forgotten it themselves, and having the courage to help them speak it again. We all build fences around our hearts to keep the pain out and sometimes to keep ourselves in. We carry our own winters, our own silent griefs. But the story of Silas and Lena reminds us that fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Healing isn't the act of erasing a scar, it's the slow, patient work of rebuilding the fence together until the space it protects finally feels like home. So here's your naming. It's in the small kindness you offer when no one is looking, in the moment you stand with someone against the wind, in the courage it takes to say, "We should start." Look for the person standing on the edge of the crowd, the one whose silence speaks volumes. If you're brave enough to step out of the shadows and offer not pity, but simple, honest presence, you might just find that the life you save is your own.